On the evening of February 20th, 1954, the President of the United States disappeared without clear explanation. Eisenhower's aides scrambled as the Associated Press briefly issued a death bulletin, reporting he had suffered a fatal heart attack. That story was quickly withdrawn, and the White House instead told reporters he'd chipped a tooth and gone to see a local dentist. Later researchers found contradictions. The Eisenhower Library holds no contemporaneous record of treatment, while dental historians point to Surgeon General logs that suggest an emergency procedure took place. The missing night became the foundation for one of the most persistent allegations in American history. The Pentagon's creation of AARO in 2022 and its release of more than 400 military UAP incidents the same year did not prove Eisenhower met with anyone unusual in 1954. But they made questions once dismissed sound harder to ignore. And as we look back, it all started with that night when the president was suddenly nowhere to be found. The disappearing president. On the night of February 20th, 1954, confusion quietly spread through Eisenhower's entourage in Palm Springs. The president could not be located. He wasn't in his suite. He wasn't on the golf course. Secret Service agents swept the grounds, while staff contacted local law enforcement in case the commander-in-chief had suddenly gone off-site without notice. For hours, the sitting president of the United States was unaccounted for, and those responsible for protecting him had no explanation. In a period before instant communication or GPS, every passing minute without contact amplified the concern. That evening, contemporaneous press wires briefly reported that Eisenhower had died, attributing it to a presumed heart attack while on vacation. The release caused immediate confusion and would have carried enormous constitutional consequences if it had proven accurate. Within hours, however, those early announcements were retracted, and the White House arranged an emergency press briefing. The official statement declared that the president had broken a dental crown and was taken for urgent treatment. Presented as fact, the dental story was intended to close down speculation. Yet when reporters sought details, who had treated him, where the office was, and why there was no prior mention of a dental problem, answers fell short. The Eisenhower Library contains no record of emergency dental work in February 1954. At the same time, some dental historians point to Surgeon General records showing an after-hours procedure logged for that night. Archival holdings and military medical logs do not always overlap, leaving researchers with conflicting evidence that continues to fuel uncertainty. This dual record has led to decades of disagreement. To one side, the absence of acknowledgement in presidential archives suggests the dental story was a cover improvised under pressure. To the other, the existence of logs from the Surgeon General's office serves as confirmation that an emergency crown repair did take place. What remains clear is that witnesses and historians disagree, records conflict, and the available evidence resists a single conclusion. Because of that, the explanation never fully satisfied investigators or the press. Eisenhower's itinerary for the evening carried only the vague entry, unavailable, a sharp contrast with the normally precise scheduling for a head of state. His military aide later gave inconsistent recollections about the night's timeline. And most strikingly, no dentist in Palm Springs ever stepped forward to confirm hosting the president in their office. That silence, whether due to ordinary confidentiality or something less routine, left the story open to interpretation. For some, this unsettled gap pointed toward a very different scenario. Over the years, military personnel and civilian accounts began to circulate, suggesting that the dental story may have been a convenient explanation for Eisenhower's sudden absence. In these accounts, the president was not confined to a chair in Palm Springs, but instead transported by convoy or aircraft to Edwards Air Force Base, situated less than 200 miles away. Edwards at the time was among the most restricted facilities in the nation. Located deep in the Mojave Desert, it had earned a reputation as the testing ground for experimental jet aircraft and rocket planes. The secrecy surrounding its work made it a location already shielded from public scrutiny, an ideal place to host sensitive events without outsiders taking notice. If Eisenhower had been flown there under strict security, it would have coincided with the escalating Cold War, a period when sudden and highly classified developments demanded direct presidential involvement. Accounts that emerged years later described unusual conditions at Edwards that night. Sections of the base were allegedly sealed off. Roads leading in were said to have been blocked to flight. Patterns restricted, and communication channels strictly monitored. Personnel stationed nearby recalled abrupt orders that vastly tightened normal security procedures. To those retellings, the atmosphere felt like preparation for something beyond routine operations. This is where the two narratives diverge most sharply. On one side, Eisenhower suffered nothing more exotic than a dental emergency, one that records suggest but don't definitively prove. On the other, pieces of testimony and circumstantial evidence imply that he left Palm Springs entirely, transported under a veil of secrecy to Edwards Air Force Base. In either case, his unexplained absence created conditions for rumor to thrive. The discrepancy between official documentation, oral recollections, and later investigative claims keeps the question unresolved. If the dental story had been purely accurate, it would be unusual for presidential archives to contain no mention. If the Edwards accounts are to be believed, then a level of security well beyond ordinary procedure was invoked to conceal his movements. Neither side settles the matter completely, which is why the disappearing president remains a subject of speculation nearly 70 years later. The situation inside Palm Springs that evening illustrates how quickly uncertainty can spiral. Reporters drafted obituaries, staff scrambled for explanations, and the public faced the eerie possibility that their president had died suddenly far from Washington. Meanwhile, at a remote military installation, unusual protocols were reportedly unfolding. Viewed together, these fragments reveal not a solved mystery, but a historical puzzle with competing layers of evidence. What Eisenhower was doing during those undocumented hours remains contested. What can be traced with confidence is the setting: a president abruptly absent, an official explanation carrying contradictions, and a parallel set of claims pointing toward one of the most secretive military bases in the United States. As researchers reassess surviving records and oral accounts, the focus often returns to Edwards. Conflicting evidence about the dental story may explain some aspects, but the simultaneous reports of heightened security at the base suggest that something significant occurred far from public view. That unresolved tension sets the stage for the next critical detail: what was happening at Edwards on that very night. The Edwards Base Lockdown. Edwards Air Force Base, known in the 1950s as the center of America's experimental flight programs, is also the setting for one of the most persistent stories tied to Eisenhower's missing night. Reports that surfaced in later decades describe the base undergoing a level of security beyond what was typical, but it's important to note from the start, these are allegations, not verified records. The earliest such account appeared in April 1954, when a spiritualist named Gerald wrote a letter describing an extraordinary lockdown at Edwards during Eisenhower's trip to Palm Springs. Light claimed heavy security and unusual restrictions across the base, but because his letter never pointed to official documentation, it remains unverified. Over the years, other alleged witnesses described abnormal conditions during that same February evening. Sections of Edwards that were usually accessible were reportedly sealed off. Roadblocks were said to have been thrown up miles outside the perimeter, and civilian workers claimed their routine access was suddenly denied. Some later recalled that their communications to coordinate deliveries or maintenance were unexpectedly cut off. These recollections became the foundation of the Edwards lockdown story. But once again, all of it comes through personal testimony rather than material that can be confirmed in official files. One of the more unusual details that recurs in later accounts involves personnel who supposedly wore unmarked fatigues, uniforms with no rank, no unit badges, and no identifying insignia. Witnesses said their movements and patrol patterns differed from what normal security at Edwards looked like. Some went as far as speculating these were not regular American military guards at all. Civilian contractors repeated similar claims, asserting that unmarked vehicles moved throughout the base that night. While these reports carry intrigue, they remain uncorroborated. Official base logs and archived Air Force records available to researchers today show no evidence of non-standard security forces patrolling Edwards in February 1954. Stories also circulated about civilian bystanders near the base who claimed they saw blacked-out convoys enter during the night. A few said they glimpsed large aircraft or transport carriers under unusual escort. Others recalled attempts at documenting strange lights in the desert sky, only to have their photographs seized by military police. But here again, researchers stress caution. These accounts are based on anonymous testimony or recollections shared decades after the alleged events, and none are supported by public records from Edwards itself. FBI, CIA, and Air Force archival summaries covering the period do not record any base-wide disruption of this nature. That lack of documentation doesn't disprove the claims, but it leaves them without firm evidence. It's important to recognize how secrecy during the Cold War may have created fertile ground for these stories. Edwards regularly hosted test flights of experimental jet and rocket programs, many of which remained classified for decades. It was normal for access to be restricted, flights rescheduled without explanation, and personnel compartmentalized to protect projects from leaks. In that era, even routine classified work could appear mysterious to civilians nearby. Layers of official secrecy from agencies like the CIA and Air Force Office of Special Investigations meant that rumors could thrive unchecked, and partial observations were often filled in with speculation. When later witnesses suggested flights were canceled, radar equipment repositioned, and entire tarmacs cleared on the night of February 20th, 1954, it raised questions because such measures exceeded even the high standards of secrecy at Edwards. If accurate, these actions would have represented preparation for something out of the ordinary. But because the surviving logs for that period contain gaps and inconsistencies, historians are left without clarity. Did those gaps reflect deliberate removal to cover extraordinary events, or simply the less rigorous record-keeping of an era in which classified activities were often undocumented? Both possibilities remain on the table. Researchers who support the allegation of a lockdown argue that the consistency across independent testimonies carries weight. They point to the overlap in descriptions, restricted movement, confiscated photographs, and unknown personnel as evidence that something significant occurred. Yet skeptics counter that witness accounts decades after the fact are influenced by cultural memory, popularized theories, and sometimes outright hoaxes. Without direct official records to anchor them, these testimonies must remain viewed as contested claims rather than established events. When considered through the broader context of 1954, the secrecy at Edwards, whether routine or intensified, carries added meaning. This was the height of the Cold War, just months before the world would learn about advanced Soviet nuclear capabilities. America relied on Edwards and a handful of similar sites to test the aircraft and weapons it believed essential to national security. In such a climate, heavy restrictions could have been entirely justified by classified projects unrelated to Eisenhower's trip. At the same time, the president's unexplained absence in Palm Springs makes it understandable why researchers saw both events as potentially linked. Taken as a whole, the claims of a lockdown at Edwards illustrate how rumor and secrecy build upon each other. On one side, there are testimonies from individuals who insist they saw or experienced events far outside standard operations. On the other, the silence of the official record suggests either that nothing unusual occurred, or that what did happen was classified at the highest levels and deliberately kept from the public record. These competing narratives have remained unresolved for 70 years, with little prospect of new documentary evidence emerging. What does stand out is the perception common to all who have told these stories: the sense that Edwards was preparing for something unlike any test flight or weapons evaluation. To them, the security posture signaled not routine operations, but the staging of an extraordinary event. If Eisenhower had in fact been transported there, the alleged base-wide measures begin to look purposeful, as though meant to create a secure environment for a sensitive meeting away from public view. This is why researchers connect the president's disappearance in Palm Springs with the allegations of unusual activity at Edwards that same night. Whether the connection is based on truth or merely on coincidence remains an unresolved question. But for those who believe Eisenhower was there, the reports of restricted zones, canceled flights, and layers of secrecy form a critical part of the story's foundation. As the narrative builds, attention naturally shifts to the question of who Eisenhower might have been meeting under such conditions. If a gathering did occur within those heavily restricted hangars, its participants would not have been casual visitors. They would have been chosen figures carrying tremendous responsibility. The next step is to consider who, according to these long-standing claims, stood alongside the president during this alleged meeting. Who were the alleged negotiators? When stories place Eisenhower inside a safeguarded hangar at Edwards that February night, they rarely describe him as standing alone. Instead, they suggest he was accompanied by a select circle of advisors, chosen from military, scientific, and even religious backgrounds. These names are not pulled from official logs, but from letters and testimonies that surfaced later, the most notable being Gerald Light's 1954 letter. In that document, Light wrote that he had been informed a delegation at Edwards included Franklin Allen of the Hearst newspapers, Dr. Edwin Norse, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and Cardinal James Francis McIntyre of Los Angeles. Importantly, these are names Light claimed, and there is no archival proof they were ever at Edwards. Historians and archivists treat this letter as unverified and, at best, circumstantial. The alleged inclusion of senior generals and strategic officers is another recurring point in these accounts. Such officials are described as men who handled nuclear deployment plans and weapons development programs, officers whose authority in the Cold War system was both technical and strategic. Their role, if present, would have been to analyze whether any demonstration of technology posed a threat to national defense, and to weigh the potential military value of what might have been offered. Here again, though, this scenario exists only in speculative retellings. No official records link specific high-ranking officers to Edwards on that night, and archivists caution against equating repetition of their names in anecdotal accounts with confirmation that they were there. Some researchers link the story of these advisors with the contested idea of Majestic 12, often portrayed as a code name for a covert group overseeing technology from non-human sources. But historians largely view the MJ-12 documents as unauthenticated. Many experts regard them as modern fabrications. Still, within the lore, the overlap between figures said to be in Eisenhower's circle that night and the names appearing in MJ-12 lists has helped fuel decades of speculation. It is essential to underline that official investigators, including archivists at the National Archives, have never validated these documents. For that reason, the idea of Majestic 12 must be presented as contested rather than presumed fact. Alongside the names of generals and scientists, Gerald Light's 1954 letter is also the source most often cited for placing Cardinal McIntyre among the party. If true, his role would not have been clerical in the ordinary sense. Rather, his presence would have reflected the cultural weight of religion in 1950s America, when moral and spiritual guidance was seen as integral to how society absorbed new ideas. While this sounds unusual from today's perspective, NASA and other federal agencies later studied how disruptive discoveries might affect social stability. Some modern ufology discussions cite the 1960 Brookings Report as evidence of this concern. That report did not prove alien contact, but it did recommend considering how discoveries in space science could affect human institutions, including religion. Against that backdrop, the alleged presence of a religious leader in an extraordinary meeting gains symbolic significance, even if the claim itself remains uncertain. The scientific contingent described in accounts of that night is equally intriguing. These supposed participants were said to include physicists and aerospace engineers who already worked at the bleeding edge of propulsion, nuclear energy, and communication systems. Their alleged purpose was straightforward: serve as technical reviewers, translating any demonstrations of novel craft or devices into terms military and political leaders could act upon. In Cold War practice, Eisenhower regularly relied on scientists in exactly this way, giving the idea surface plausibility. Yet again, there is no supporting documentation that specific scientists were at Edwards. What does exist is the consistency of these claims across different retellings, which is what has kept them in circulation despite lacking physical evidence. What gives these names power in the lore is not simply their expertise, but their stature. The rumor does not point to unknown outsiders or tabloids, but to prominent officials with careers that thrived on credibility and discretion. If any of them had truly been part of such a gathering, their involvement would have carried enormous risk. Association alone with unverified contact stories could end careers. In the 1950s environment of suspicion and loyalty tests, the reputational harm from rumors of this kind could have been devastating. Proponents argue this makes the story harder to dismiss. Why would a forged account invoke highly visible figures instead of fabricating anonymous attendees? Archivists, conversely, argue that precisely because the names are so prominent, their use is more consistent with myth-making than with fact. If one evaluates this through the lens of risk management, the story takes on an instructive shape. Eisenhower, as the president, could at least hide behind the official dental emergency. For those placed next to him in the rumor, there was no such cover if their presence ever became known. High command officers and senior scientists could not plausibly disavow involvement if records surfaced, meaning that only the most serious matters could have justified their participation. If fabricated, the legend gambles credibility on figures whose reputations would only be harmed by association. If real, their inclusion would reflect the administration's acknowledgement that the stakes were beyond routine policy. The narrative link to Majestic 12 adds a final layer of complexity. Within ufology, MJ12 is often cited as evidence of structured oversight of extraterrestrial technology, but in academic and archival circles, the documents are held to be modern inventions without provenance. Whether or not such a committee existed, its mythology has grown because the names said to have been part of that body overlap with the kinds of individuals described as advisors at Edwards. It is a convergence of storylines, one rooted in a controversial set of documents, the other in oral accounts and a letter from Gerald Light. Together they sustain the belief that if anything extraordinary happened that February night, it was deliberated by the highest caliber of American leadership available. Even critics admit that the persistence of these names is unusual. If the alleged attendees had been anonymous mechanics or untraceable civilians, the story might have been dismissed as folklore long ago. Instead, the rumor insists on well-known generals, advisors, and clerics, which keeps researchers revisiting the case. Archivists point out that this is also exactly how legends cement themselves, by anchoring the extraordinary to familiar figures who lend the tale weight. Thus, the prominence of the alleged delegates can both add a sheen of plausibility and mark the story as constructed myth. Ultimately, what matters is not only who these individuals were, but what they were supposedly called upon to consider. These are the figures whose alleged presence makes the story about far more than a missing president. It transforms the event into a potential negotiation of world-defining consequence. And while their participation cannot be proven, their recurring mention underscores the gravity attributed to the encounter itself. The remaining question is what, if anything, was proposed during that night. Accounts do not agree on the nature of the visitors or what they expected in return. Some stories describe starkly different delegations with incompatible demands, forcing Eisenhower and his advisors to weigh offers that touched on survival at both global and national levels. It is at this point in the narrative that the rumors shift from the question of who was present to the deeper question of what was on the table. The alien offers. Accounts attributed to that night do not describe a single outside delegation, but rather two very different ones. The first narrative comes through contactee reports and later writing by Michael Sala, researcher/author, who repeats earlier claims that a Nordic group was present. These beings were described as tall, human-like in appearance, with features that allowed them to almost blend among people under ordinary circumstances. In these testimonies, the Nordics were not offering weapons or devices, but delivering a condition. Their message, according to Sala and others who circulated similar accounts, was clear: abandon the arms race and dismantle nuclear stockpiles. They warned of long-term damage to the planet, of dangers to human health, and even of consequences beyond Earth's environment. In exchange, they were said to promise guidance, moral, scientific, and spiritual. It is essential to emphasize that these are allegations reported by individual claimants. There are no authenticated government documents confirming such offers were made. For Eisenhower and the Cold War leadership, even an alleged proposal like this would have presented an almost impossible scenario. By 1954, nuclear capability had become the backbone of national security policy, not just a tool of offense, but a deterrent designed to prevent direct conflict with the Soviet Union. Relinquishing nuclear weapons unilaterally, without guarantees that Moscow would do the same, would have meant exposing the United States to strategic collapse. From a strategic perspective, the supposed Nordic offer may have aligned with the dream of peace, but collided with the realities of geopolitical rivalry. Against this backdrop, another account gained traction in later decades. Figures like William Cooper, former naval intelligence employee with disputed claims, and Phil Schneider, a contractor who became known for controversial talks in the 1990s before his contested death, described a second presence at Edwards. These were the so-called Greys, beings recounted as smaller, thin, with gray skin and oversized black eyes. Unlike the Nordics, their reported approach did not include ideological demands. Testimonies portray them as transactional, offering materials or devices that appeared ahead of known science, without asking for disarmament. Their interest, according to Cooper and Schneider's accounts, was in exchange. The details vary. Some narratives speak of limited access to human biology or agreements about abductions. Others stop at vague mentions of cooperation. What is consistent is that they framed their bargain in technological terms rather than moral or geopolitical ones. This supposed binary created two starkly contrasting choices. Disarm with the Nordics, sacrificing deterrence but gaining mentorship, or engage with the Greys, preserving U.S. sovereignty and extracting practical advancement. In a world gripped by nuclear standoff, Eisenhower's calculus, if such an offer was ever on the table, would have leaned toward the pragmatic. American policymakers were already contending with reports of espionage, Soviet hydrogen bomb tests, and debates within Congress about how many weapons were enough to preserve deterrence. 10, 100, or thousands. To abandon that arsenal for an unverified assurance of peace would have seemed reckless, regardless of the promise of higher guidance. The alternative, if these stories are taken at face value, looked far more consistent with Cold War logic. The Gray proposition required no treaties with enemies, no assurances that rivals would act in good faith. It hinted at superiority through machines and systems, faster aircraft, more precise guidance, better surveillance tools, and possible breakthroughs in communications. Choosing them, if the decision fell to Eisenhower, meant not exposing the nation to imbalance but reinforcing its advantage. Researchers who analyze these narratives often note that Eisenhower's earlier career shaped his reputed response. As a general overseeing Allied strategy in World War II, he had seen truces collapse and alliances fracture under pressure. As president, he balanced soaring military costs against a desire to avoid another global conflict. Scholars who review contactee accounts stress that his decision, as alleged, aligns with the persona of a pragmatic commander, prepared to listen, but unwilling to expose his nation to catastrophic vulnerability. Thus in these stories, the Nordics disarmament plan was left behind, and the Greys' transactional offer was tentatively accepted. It is necessary at this stage to underscore again, there are no declassified documents that confirm such meetings or bargains. What survives are testimonies, whistleblower accounts, letters like Gerald Light's, and writings by figures whose credibility is heavily debated. From Gerald Light's 1954 correspondence to Cooper's later lectures and Schneider's public appearances, each source has been contested and lacks corroboration from official government records. For editors and researchers, it is vital to maintain this frame. These are allegations and narratives, not proven events. Cultural historians add another interpretive layer. They observe that the Nordic versus Grey distinction mirrors larger shifts in UFO folklore. In the 1950s, Space Brother stories emphasized benevolent, human-like visitors urging peace and spiritual growth. By the 1960s, and especially into the abduction reports of later decades, the imagery of clinical, gray-skinned beings took prominence. Scholars argue this evolution reveals more about changing social fears, from nuclear annihilation to concerns over personal autonomy and experimentation, than about verified encounters. Within this perspective, the tale of Eisenhower faced with two choices can be read less as interspecies diplomacy and more as a merger of those cultural tropes into one dramatic frame. Still, within ufology, the idea of Eisenhower faced with such a fork in the road remains one of the most compelling points of speculation. Advocates argue that when unexplained leaps in American technology began to follow in the late 1950s and 60s, they reflected the long-term effects of that alleged bargain. Critics point instead to the natural progression of human science, pointing out the trajectory led by semiconductor research, military investment in communication systems, and aerospace innovation born of Cold War competition. Yet the persistence of these stories signals their lasting grip. Whether or not Eisenhower made a choice, decades of anecdotal accounts, contested whistleblower testimonies, and speculative writings have framed this night as a decisive moment when humanity could have turned toward peace, but instead pursued survival through superior tools. To many who repeat them, these narratives explain why the following generation lived in a world shaped by drastic technological gains rather than nuclear disarmament. If we follow the rumor to its conclusion, Eisenhower is remembered not for embracing an altruistic offer, but for favoring the course that aligned with strategic survival. The alleged meeting at Edwards, in this telling, marked a turning point away from idealism and toward leveraging foreign knowledge for practical ends. From that perspective, what unfolded in the decades after becomes central. The United States entered a period of rapid breakthroughs in science and defense, developments so swift that some researchers trace them back to this alleged night of negotiation. Examining those advances, and how suspiciously timed they appeared, has kept the Edwards story alive well into the 21st century. Technology leaps after 1954. In the years that followed 1954, the United States witnessed a pace of technological development that changed both civilian life and national defense. By the end of that decade, transistors were replacing vacuum tubes, laying the foundation for semiconductors and the integrated circuits that would follow. Advances in metallurgy, communications, and optics began to move suddenly from theory into practice. These changes are widely acknowledged and well documented. What remains debated is the reason for their rapid arrival. Were they the product of strategic Cold War investment, or do they align too closely with the timeline of claims about Eisenhower's missing night to be coincidence? Historians of technology are cautious, pointing first to the financial forces that define the era. Wartime momentum bled directly into Cold War budgets. Research and development enjoyed unprecedented funding, and federal contracts linked universities, laboratories, and private defense firms. In that environment, breakthroughs were expected to happen quickly. But even with this context, the speed of semiconductor miniaturization still stands out. The transistor was invented at Bell Labs in 1947, yet within little more than a decade, the technology had moved from scientific novelty to silicon-based circuitry powering entire industries. Computers that once filled rooms began shrinking toward portable machines in surprisingly short time frames. For advocates of the 1954 treaty story, this sudden collapse of scale looks suspicious. For skeptics, it reflects nothing more than sustained, well-funded innovation by some of the world's most talented scientists. Fiber optic technology provides another example. The concept of transmitting light through strands of glass was known in theory earlier in the century, but practical systems only came together in the 1960s and 70s. Crafting glass pure enough to carry signals required leaps in chemistry and manufacturing. Supporters of the exchange theory highlight rumors that defense contractors were quietly studying unusual alloys in the late 1950s, the same contractors who stepped into fiber research years later. To them, the overlap feels telling. Engineers, however, consider it a natural outcome of incremental refinement supported by extensive chemical engineering research. It is worth remembering that most corporate and academic archives attribute these advances to ordinary, if impressive, human achievement. The arrival of stealth technology has also drawn attention. By the late 1970s, prototypes appeared with angular shapes engineered to scatter radar. Public explanations credit mathematical modeling and the rise of computer simulation, suggesting that once equations were correctly applied, novel shapes became feasible. Yet whispers have circulated from within aerospace circles about strange compounds appearing in labs, materials behaving in ways that engineers had never encountered before. Whether those whispers derive from misinterpretation, secrecy around advanced polymers, or something stranger is unresolved. The official record points only to classified, but explainable experiments in radar cross-section reduction. Anything more remains anecdotal. Documents from the defense contracting boom between the 1950s and 60s add to the suspicion for some researchers. Archives show contracts routed to Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Northrop under vague labels such as materials analysis or airframe evaluation. Oversight was minimal because the projects were buried in discretionary budgets. Those inclined to connect dots see these documents as possible traces of research into unusual materials, though nothing in the language confirms such conclusions. The simpler explanation is that the government was investing heavily in advanced aeronautics with classification masking its priorities. Without proof, the connection to exotic knowledge remains speculation. In conventional accounts of technological history, major innovations leave trails, patents, conference papers, and incremental prototypes. What confuses some observers about mid-century breakthroughs is the way certain technologies seem to appear with fewer transitional steps than expected. Integrated circuitry, radar-evading aircraft, and fiber optic communication each look in retrospect like sharp leaps rather than gradual rises. For enthusiasts of the Eisenhower encounter, such gaps in the historical record suggest external information filled in missing steps. Critics counter that gaps are common in classified military research, which by design avoids leaving obvious paper trails until results are safe for public disclosure. Civilian adoption tracked closely with military innovation. Semiconductors reached the consumer market only after being essential to guided missile systems and portable radios. Fiber optics entered commercial communications after years of interest from intelligence units seeking secure lines. Even medical imaging benefited from technology, first honed in aerospace and defense laboratories. To some, these parallel rollouts hint at knowledge originating somewhere unseen, flowing first into defense networks before seeping into the public sphere. To skeptics, the explanation is once again simpler. Military necessity drove early adoption, and civilian industries capitalized once cost and reliability followed. Anchoring this debate are a few important, research-supported facts that place the matter in perspective. The U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book investigated 12,618 UFO reports between 1947 and 1969, with 701 officially categorized as unidentified. The existence of unexplained cases created space for claims of secret study, but provided no proof of exotic technology. Much later, the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ADIP, operated with a budget of about $22 million over nearly a decade. Hardly the scale one would expect if alien hardware were openly flowing into American laboratories. And as recently as 2023, NASA's independent UAP study team concluded there was no convincing evidence that artifacts recovered by the U.S. tied back to non-human technology. These findings frame the broader question. Rapid progress after 1954 is undisputed, but proof of an extraterrestrial source remains absent. For those intent on linking treaties to innovation, the Skunk Works division of Lockheed is often a centerpiece. Its reputation for sudden leaps, producing aircraft ahead of competitors in design and performance, has long invited speculation. Engineers who worked there described strict secrecy and the presence of classified models and data few outside the division ever saw. While believers cite anecdotes of technology beyond contemporary theory, the official explanation credits heavy government investment, extraordinary talent, and compartmentalization. Again, no documents confirm an outside source. Consumer electronics firms also experienced abrupt growth later in the same period. Microchips entered household appliances, televisions, and eventually personal computers. Some of this work had roots in defense-funded labs, but expanded rapidly once accessible to the private market. Were these offshoots of classified programs, or simply the trickle-down effect of Cold War priorities? With declassified records consistently emphasizing human research, the treaty hypothesis remains a matter of belief rather than evidence. By the 1980s, the U.S. held unmatched positions in stealth warfare, digital computing, global surveillance, and advanced communications. Each of these systems came together quickly, but each also has a clear lineage in wartime urgency, industrial capacity, and national funding priorities. Whether one decides that this tempo was beyond ordinary progress or merely the inevitable result of a powerful nation mobilizing its resources depends entirely on interpretation. What remains certain is only this. The pace of mid-century innovation was striking, and its speed left many to wonder if unseen factors were involved. Official records attribute those advances to Cold War investment and secrecy. Enthusiasts suggest a more extraordinary influence. Between those two positions lies a wealth of unanswered questions and the recognition that secrecy itself, military, political, and cultural, makes definitive conclusions difficult to reach. The focus on technology also obscures another dimension of the alleged 1954 agreement. Beyond materials and machines, stories about Edwards hint at provisions said to affect ordinary citizens in direct and unsettling ways. The question of how such terms might have been enforced or ignored would emerge forcefully in the decades that followed. Abductions and discrepancies. Among the most debated elements in the lore surrounding Eisenhower's supposed agreement is the claim that it included a clause on human abductions. Later testimonies and retellings suggest this provision was meant to regulate activity, allowing a limited number of people to be taken under strict conditions. The alleged safeguards outlined in these stories included caps on the number permitted each year, requirements that no permanent harm come to subjects, and even lists to be submitted detailing who had been taken and in what condition they were returned. In theory, such rules would have established boundaries, technology for controlled access to citizens. But the accounts that began appearing in the decades after 1954 suggest a very different reality. By the mid-1960s, abduction narratives began appearing more consistently in the public record. The case of Barney and Betty Hill in 1961 is widely considered a watershed moment, an extensively documented account that introduced themes later repeated across countless reports. From that point forward, stories multiplied. Through the 1970s and 1980s, individuals across diverse communities described experiences they could not reconcile, being removed from cars, taken from bedrooms, or suddenly transported to unfamiliar environments. Researchers in the field have documented hundreds, and potentially thousands, of such claims, but they remain anecdotal, medically disputed, and unverified. While their numbers are difficult to pin down, what is clear is that the volume of reports far exceeded any alleged limits the supposed treaty was believed to impose. The common features within these accounts were unsettlingly consistent. Witnesses described paralysis under bright light, loss of control, and clinical procedures conducted on examining tables. Many recalled needles, surgical instruments, or devices used to extract biological samples. Some spoke of reproductive experiments, neurological probing, or encounters with beings that seemed intent on genetic manipulation. Others remembered seeing hybrid figures, part human, part something unfamiliar, and reported an impression that experimentation on human physiology was being actively conducted. While skeptics interpret these memories as sleep paralysis, cultural influence, or psychological stress, the recurrence of such details across otherwise unconnected individuals left researchers struggling to dismiss all of it as coincidence. Almost all who identified themselves as abductees reported aftereffects. These included unexplainable scars or markings, sensations of missing time, and ongoing psychological trauma. Yet within the framework of the alleged treaty, such outcomes raised immediate red flags. If supervising authorities were meant to ensure that no one was harmed and all actions were disclosed, the consistency of such complaints suggests either outright violations or complete breakdown of oversight. However, it is important to stress that mainstream institutions have not treated these physical claims as conclusive. Panels of scientists, including the 2023 independent NASA UAP study group, have noted that personal testimony alone is insufficient. Their conclusion was clear: credible assessments demand multi-sensor data and peer-reviewed analysis, not solely anecdotal statements, no matter how emotionally compelling they may be. This disconnect created what has often been referred to as the core discrepancy of the Greada narrative. The supposed protections simply do not align with the massive testimony that began to surface. If oversight existed, the lists of abductees were never released. By the 1970s, abduction themes were appearing in books, television interviews, and even talked about in law enforcement case files. Each time officials were pressed, there was silence. If agreements were in place, where was the record keeping? If protections were guaranteed, where was the evidence of enforcement? The absence of both intensified suspicion. In this climate, many researchers interpreted the explosion of abduction stories in grim terms. Either the treaty was never honored by the Greys, or it was tolerated in violation because the technological benefits to the United States were judged too valuable to lose. Rumors circulated that some within the government began to worry the alleged deal had spiraled outside any control. Still, no such concerns were ever acknowledged in the public sphere, confined instead to whispered speculation, unconfirmed leaks, or memoirs citing unnamed sources. Abduction narratives also unfolded alongside a surge of classified military projects. The 1960s and 70s saw immense Pentagon spending on aerospace research, materials science, and weapons development, much of it hidden under vague budget lines. To some, the timing reflected simple Cold War pressures. To others, however, the coincidence was too close. They argued that breakthroughs in laboratories, from computer miniaturization to exotic materials, hinted at a technological pipeline running parallel with citizens' reported experiences. In such a view, violations of any agreed limits were tolerated, rationalized as the cost of progress. Official institutions treated abductees with skepticism bordering on dismissal. Many who spoke out faced reputation damage and ridicule. Yet within the community of claimed experiencers were military veterans, academics, and professionals with seemingly little to gain from fabrication. They often emphasized that the trauma had outlasted the experience itself, compelling them to tell their story despite mockery. These accounts cannot be taken as proof, but they remain persistent, often shared against the self-interest of those involved. It is here that historical context matters. Between 1947 and 1969, the U.S. Air Force Project Blue Book investigated 12,618 UFO cases. Of these, 701 were left unexplained. That statistic demonstrates an important distinction. Unexplained incidents are not proof of extraterrestrial origin. Nonetheless, it highlights that unusual reports were common and often resistant to conventional explanation. This established a pattern in which official inquiry produced incomplete answers, fostering an environment where extraordinary claims took root. Applying that precedent to the abduction claims reveals why the discrepancy is so enduring. On one side is an alleged treaty clause guaranteeing oversight, non-harm, and disclosure. On the other is a flood of accounts describing violation, harm, and secrecy. If the agreement was real, enforcement failed. If it never existed, then the persistence of reports demands explanation through another lens, whether psychological, cultural, or otherwise. What is consistent across both views is a gap. Protection was expected by some, but protection was not felt by those who reported the experiences. Researchers who study secrecy argue that effective monitoring could never have taken place. To reveal an enforcement mechanism would have required admitting the existence of the treaty. Admitting that existence, in turn, would have confirmed collusion in activities against citizens. Leaders avoided that exposure, meaning oversight was structurally impossible from the start. If so, then every abduction story, verified or not, would fall outside meaningful accountability. Ordinary individuals bore the cost for decisions made in silence, regardless of whether those decisions were myth or historical reality. This remains the tension surrounding the abductions said to follow Eisenhower's night at Edwards. Accounts mount, testimonies repeat patterns, physical experiences remain unresolved, and yet official structures maintain denial. Abduction research communities continue to collect narratives, while mainstream science demands stronger evidence before accepting any extraordinary conclusions. Between the two sits the ongoing discrepancy, widening over time as more storytellers add their voices without closure from authoritative sources. The enduring divide over these claims set the stage for later developments. Public denial persisted, but reports never ceased. As officials remained silent, other institutions began confronting the reality of unexplained encounters in a more open way. When military pilots, radar operators, and government hearings began acknowledging unidentified aerial phenomena decades later, it created an environment where the long-ignored issues of oversight and accountability acquired fresh urgency. This shift would come to a head not in Eisenhower's era, but many years later, when official documentation finally began to emerge. Modern UFO disclosure and Pentagon reports. By the mid-2020s, discussion about unidentified phenomena had shifted from rumor and speculation to official briefings and televised hearings. Modern disclosure efforts by the Pentagon put records, statistics, and sworn testimony into the Congressional record, giving researchers material that could be compared against the decades of earlier allegations. This change in how the government described unidentified craft gave a new framework for evaluating whether the echoes of 1954 were circumstantial coincidence or signs of continuity. The most visible institutional pivot came in June of 2021, when the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment referencing roughly 140 incidents investigated between 2004 and 2021. That report concluded that most of the objects remained unexplained. The following year, 2022, the Pentagon briefed lawmakers that the number of recorded cases had grown to over 400. In July of that same year, the Department of Defense formalized a new office, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, making UAP analysis an enduring mission within the defense establishment. These steps, documented in public filings and hearings, marked a transition. Unexplained aerial encounters were no longer relegated to tabloid culture, but entered the structure of congressional oversight. The May 17, 2022 open hearing before the House Intelligence Committee was the first of its kind in half a century. Officials acknowledged roughly 400 reports in military databases and conceded that many of them lacked ordinary explanations. During that session, lawmakers pressed for answers about objects executing sudden accelerations or remaining stationary in high winds. The hearing itself became a milestone, widely reported across outlets including the New York Times and CNN. Researchers later described it as the moment when the language shifted from dismissive terms like flying saucers to the Pentagon's formal phrasing of UAP. Subsequent disclosures outlined how AARO's mandate expanded. By early 2023, press coverage noted that the office was reviewing not only hundreds of contemporary incidents, but also more than 800 historical cases pulled from archives. A portion of those reports remained unexplained after review, even when engineers, analysts, and intelligence officers examined sensor data across multiple systems. This confirmed that a consistent subset of cases resisted reduction to familiar categories like drones, balloons, or weather events. For researchers interested in continuity, the presence of an unexplained residue carried significance, though it did not establish any direct connection to mid-century claims. The testimonies that followed between 2023 and 2025 added another dimension. Active-duty pilots, retired officers, and radar specialists testified under oath that they had personally observed objects exhibiting unusual behaviors. In contrast to earlier eras where experiencers were often civilians lacking documentation, these witnesses brought along cockpit video, radar tracks, and infrared footage. Modern military systems provided corroboration in ways that 1950s-era reports could never match. As hearings continued through 2024 and into 2025, uniformed personnel described objects performing sudden accelerations, hovering without obvious propulsion, and in some instances transitioning seamlessly from air into water. Descriptions of these encounters are what caught public attention most forcefully. Pilots testified that the craft lacked visible exhaust plumes, wings, or control surfaces, yet outpaced jet interceptors designed for supersonic flight. Some reported objects that appeared metallic and disc-shaped, sometimes triangular or oval, silent yet responsive to their presence. These attributes struck observers as reminiscent of accounts that had circulated since the 1950s. The connection is circumstantial, not verification, but the resonance across 70 years posed questions about whether the same type of technology had been recorded across generations. One of the 2025 milestones came on September 9th, during a task force hearing that drew wide media coverage. Outlets such as Defense Scoop and Stars and Stripes reported on veterans delivering testimony, some presenting imagery captured during training missions. Footage shown privately to lawmakers depicted small craft approaching naval vessels with apparent disregard for defensive perimeters. Witnesses under oath described weapons systems becoming unresponsive and targeting software failing when the objects entered close range. The hearings noted this publicly, an unusual admission for the Pentagon, which rarely concedes system interference without explanation. It was one of several moments that reframed these encounters as not just curiosities, but operational concerns. The Pentagon's 2025 compiled summaries included incident categories ranging from simple sightings to Category Red cases where multiple independent sensors confirmed the same event simultaneously. Radar plots, infrared recordings, and visual observation often lined up. Such triangulation dismissed theories of systematic malfunction. Congressional transcripts captured officers explaining how these objects were tracked across distances in coordinated formations, sometimes breaking apart and rejoining without aerodynamic penalty. At least some cases showed transmedium capability, entering the ocean and emerging again at speed. These features are striking parallels to descriptions first recorded in mid-century witness accounts, but they remain provocatively similar rather than evidentially linked. Pilots and commanders repeatedly stressed in testimony that such objects were not only seen, but interacted with their environment. Several Navy pilots recounted losing weapons lock when they tried to engage unidentified craft. Others explained that navigation displays scrambled despite no signs of electronic warfare from enemy aircraft. These details, carried in official reports, treated UAP not as flights of imagination, but as technical anomalies with safety implications. Yet Pentagon officials cautiously emphasized that there is no evidence tying such systems to foreign adversaries. That phrasing, deliberately narrow, left lawmakers and the public without a clear answer, but suggested officials wanted to rule out rival nations without exploring further speculation on record. Each disclosure cycle reinforced for the public that the issue was ongoing, not historical. By 2025, the compilation of reports had grown into the thousands worldwide, with AARO acknowledging hundreds under active review. U.S. allies also provided data, expanding the phenomenon beyond American airspace. Perhaps most unsettling for policymakers were repeated accounts of unidentified objects observed near nuclear test ranges or active weapons platforms. This pattern echoed historical reports from the Cold War, when missiles allegedly shut down or radar installations ceased functioning at sensitive moments. Once again, patterns recorded in sworn testimony aligned loosely with themes voiced in treaty rumors from 1954, especially the notion that nuclear technology was a focal point. Public reaction to the 2025 hearings reflected a divided landscape. For many, the sight of decorated pilots using congressional transcripts to describe disc-shaped craft hovering silently felt like confirmation of what had long been speculated. For others, the lack of public censor data and unclassified supporting material preserved doubt. News features often juxtaposed words like reminiscent and eerily similar, avoiding language of proof. That framing echoed the cautious tone of scholars who, while acknowledging the parallels to mid-century accounts, insisted similarity does not equal causation. The consistency of the testimony nevertheless altered the conversation. Lawmakers listened more seriously, with polling data showing a marked increase in public support for greater transparency and funding toward UAP analysis. If Eisenhower's disappearance had once been treated as fringe, the official record now included descriptions of craft whose behaviors matched rumors that emerged during that era. The bridge between speculation and record was not one of direct evidence, but of resemblance across time. This left researchers asking a set of questions rather than drawing conclusions. Were modern sightings proof of an ongoing arrangement? Or were they separate phenomena coincidentally recorded in a similar way? Skeptics emphasized the psychological and cultural persistence of saucer imagery, cautioning that observers may frame unknowns through familiar archetypes. Enthusiasts countered that sensor-backed detections showed something more than imagination at work. Both sides agreed on at least one point: unknown craft capable of maneuvering close to U.S. defenses are a matter of national security. By late 2025, the Pentagon acknowledged in official transcripts that a subset of incidents remains unexplained even after full technical review. Veteran testimonies, confirmed by radar, video, and infrared data, stood as public record. These disclosures carried implications beyond immediate military readiness. They opened a corridor of interpretation stretching back across decades, reminding audiences of stories that began with an absent president in Palm Springs. Whether those stories represent myth, coincidence, or continuity remained unanswered. The record of testimony and official acknowledgement now raises a further question. How did the United States decide to handle technological secrecy after the 1950s? And what role did major aerospace and defense programs play in managing any discoveries? To track those implications requires looking toward the intersecting histories of space exploration and military contracting, where secrecy became routine and acceleration. In advanced research carried unmistakable weight. Space programs and defense contracts. By the early 1960s, space had become the ultimate domain of competition, and U.S. investment expanded on an unprecedented scale. The formation of NASA in 1958 is commonly understood as a direct response to the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik. Within a mere decade, the United States moved from tentative suborbital flights to successful manned lunar missions. Mainstream historians attribute that rise to Cold War urgency, vast budgets, and a concentration of top scientific talent. Billions of dollars were channeled into laboratories and aerospace companies, supported by a steady pipeline of government contracts. For most analysts, that momentum alone explains the sudden acceleration. But for some researchers, the pace of the space race remains puzzling, prompting speculation that hidden discoveries may have been guiding developments alongside standard engineering. NASA's visible achievements unfolded alongside a less public dimension: the expansion of defense contracts to major aerospace firms. Lockheed, Boeing, and North American Aviation were recipients of projects labeled under propulsion research, materials testing, and aerospace design. Line items in congressional appropriations often carried vague descriptions, leaving details shielded from scrutiny. Some investigative journalists have noted how budgets in these categories greatly exceeded visible deliverables, raising the possibility that contractors were exploring unconventional propulsion or energy concepts. Advocates of a more extraordinary explanation argue these classified avenues allowed technology to be studied outside public view. Critics counter that such secrecy was entirely expected during the Cold War, when disclosure risks could compromise strategies against the Soviet Union. The result was a striking divide between public records and classified work. Civilian scientists saw early glimpses of satellite data or upper atmosphere tests, but entire fields of research drifted into security clearances. What had once appeared in journals or academic conferences often disappeared into black-budget projects. To those outside the secrecy system, the sudden absence of findings suggested information was being redirected. Official policy attributed this to military necessity, limiting intelligence leaks in a high-stakes arms race. Yet the timing has drawn attention from researchers who see in this shift a potential inflection point, when information beyond conventional science may have been sequestered. Still, the evidence for this remains speculative. No declassified files confirm such an extraordinary rationale. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration unveiled the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as SDI, and described it as a missile shield built on futuristic concepts. Billions of dollars were spent developing lasers, orbital interceptors, and particle beam designs. Publicly, the program was derided as unrealistic, and many of its components were said to have failed or remained unfinished. Yet large portions of SDI research vanished into classified repositories, where their outcomes remain unclear. Some analysts argue this was proof the science never worked. Others suggest that workable technologies may have been absorbed into restricted programs at a level beyond public disclosure. The ambiguity encouraged a persistent line of speculation, whether SDI was partly a cover for exploring more advanced systems than publicly admitted. The present era reflects that trajectory with the creation of the U.S. Space Force. On the surface, it consolidates oversight of satellites, missile detection, and orbital defenses. But behind the official duties, contracting patterns suggest work continues on exotic propulsion, energy systems, and experimental vehicles. The mainstream explanation emphasizes keeping pace with growing adversary capabilities, particularly China's and Russia's development of anti-satellite weapons. Still, some researchers insist that Space Force is the latest in a long line of institutional mechanisms designed to manage highly sensitive technology first hidden decades earlier. Its very existence thus becomes part of two narratives, either a rational extension of Cold War precedents or the formal home for research long associated with the extraordinary. Private industry complicates the picture further. Firms such as SpaceX and Blue Origin deliver reusable rockets and ambitious interplanetary goals, demonstrating engineering excellence before global audiences. Yet certain technologies, heat shielding, guidance systems, and novel alloys, have raised questions among observers who note how swiftly they moved into operational use. Classified clauses in federal contracts ensure that some research by such companies remains restricted, even when launches themselves are broadcast. Critics of the controlled inheritance theory see this as typical public-private partnership. Advocates argue it could provide a discreet way of distributing sensitive material into a sphere protected under corporate secrecy. Official documents make no confirmation either way, leaving the suggestion unproven. The timeline of aerospace leaps fuels both interpretations. In the 1940s, engineering revolved around piston engines and the earliest jets. By the 1960s, re-entry shielding and precision guidance were in active use. By the 1980s, stealth technology emerged with designs that confounded radar in ways earlier airframes never had. To mainstream analysts, this progression reflects the logical outcomes of Cold War funding and skilled teams working under pressure. To researchers inclined toward suspicion, the apparent jumps look less like gradual development and more like sudden infusions of capability. Both readings rely on the same record. The disagreement lies in how to interpret its pace and silence. Black budgets expanded alongside these changes. Tens of billions were allocated to projects whose deliverables never became public hardware. Contractors and engineers often worked on segmented parts of designs without visibility into their final use. Such compartmentalization had sound security logic. It prevented adversaries from penetrating entire programs through a single breach. It also reinforced speculation that the system provided ideal cover for managing technologies deemed unsuitable for public release. Investigative journalists have alleged that contract channels became a deliberate mechanism for obscuring advanced work. Yet no declassified evidence proves the existence of a hidden treaty-driven pipeline. What can be documented is a system of secrecy that complicates accountability, regardless of the origin of what was being studied. Three research-supported examples ground this debate. NASA's formal creation in 1958 was a direct reaction to Sputnik, and its achievements, culminating in Apollo, were explicitly justified in public as Cold War competition. Project Blue Book, operating between 1947 and 1969, investigated over 12,000 UFO reports, providing an official backdrop to the period in which funding surged. And decades later, the revelation of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ADIP, funded at $22 million between 2007 and 2012, showed that even in modern times, small but real Pentagon programs have investigated aerial anomalies. These facts demonstrate that classified spending tied to unusual research has been real, but at scales and in frameworks that are not evidence of mid-century alien treaties. Oversight mechanisms have also begun to shift. In December 2022, Congress mandated the creation of records infrastructure devoted to unidentified phenomena, and by 2024 the National Archives had created Record Group 615, the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Records Collection. This provided an official pathway for agencies to transfer documents related to UAP. While gaps in classification disputes will persist, the introduction of such structures complicates the view that secrecy is entirely unchecked. Parallel to speculation, concrete initiatives now exist to improve declassification and oversight. The question remains unresolved. Was the space boom only the product of Cold War urgency, vast intelligence budgets, and rigorous engineering? Or does the sequence of programs, from NASA's birth to stealth aircraft, SDI, and now Space Force, conceal another layer of continuity seeded long before? Both interpretations rely on assembling fragments of evidence, and neither can yet answer definitively. Analysts depend on contract patterns, funding gaps, and absences in the record. Advocates of the extraordinary see those as signs. Defenders of mainstream history see them as noise generated by secrecy that could be explained through Cold War necessity alone. As these competing narratives develop, they set the stage for another persistent element: the individuals who claim to carry direct knowledge of extraordinary agreements. Some gave detailed warnings, pointed to hidden programs, and insisted the government was concealing a deal. Their stories often ended abruptly, raising questions about cost, silence, and risk. And even when disputed among themselves, their accounts continue to shape how the timeline from Eisenhower's era is understood today. Patterns of silence and whistleblowers. In considering how secrecy might have been preserved across decades, the role of whistleblowers becomes impossible to ignore. A noticeable rhythm runs through these accounts. Individuals step forward claiming knowledge of hidden agreements, issue warnings, gain attention, and then face either discrediting, professional loss, or abrupt removal from the public stage. This cycle, whether coincidence or something more deliberate, has created the impression of a long-running pattern, voices emerging to speak, only for silence to quickly follow. One of the most cited figures is William Cooper, a former Navy serviceman who began lecturing in the 1980s about alleged secret programs tied to extraterrestrial deals. Cooper told audiences that during his time in military intelligence, he accessed material pointing to agreements made in the 1950s. His presentations mixed government secrecy, UFO narratives, and warnings about encroaching authoritarian control. For Cooper, the alleged bargain was less mythology than a betrayal of public trust, an arrangement struck without consent that jeopardized national security and individual rights. His 1991 book, Behold a Pale Horse, became a touchstone for conspiracy literature, containing documents and claims he framed as proof that the government had concealed such matters for decades. In 2001, Cooper was killed during a confrontation with law enforcement near his Arizona home. Official reports described it as the consequence of his resistance to arrest. Supporters, however, saw the timing and violence as suspicious. It is important to state what the record shows. Cooper's death occurred in a police action. While many view the circumstances as troubling, no conclusive public evidence ties it directly to suppression of his testimony. Phil Schneider's story mirrors some of that pattern. A geological engineer who described himself as a contractor on black-budget projects, Schneider gave lectures across the mid-1990s claiming involvement in underground base construction, including sites he alleged housed non-human entities. He spoke openly about treaties he believed were struck during Eisenhower's era, connecting them to abduction accounts and technology transfer. More than once, Schneider linked his knowledge to operations involving deep subterranean facilities, saying he survived a violent encounter with non-human beings. His lectures, though controversial, spread widely among UFO researchers and audiences already disenchanted with official secrecy. In January 1996, Schneider was found dead. The death was officially ruled a suicide. Family members and some supporters disputed that conclusion, citing injuries and circumstances they believed undermined the ruling. Again, it is worth being direct. Schneider's death was determined by authorities to be self-inflicted, but it remains a point of contention in public discussion. Like Cooper's case, no verifiable evidence proves deliberate silencing, though proponents often view the outcome through that lens. What unites these stories is less factual certainty, and more the framework they offer. Both Cooper and Schneider described treaties initiated in the 1950s. Both tied the idea of technological leaps to costs borne by civilians. Both warned that secrecy had spiraled into something corrosive to democracy itself. Their deaths are often cited as evidence for suppression, yet the official records provide alternative explanations. Here lies the dilemma. Skeptics highlight the conspiratorial nature of their claims and their often erratic personal backgrounds, while advocates note the striking similarities in their content, delivered years apart, before each man died under contentious conditions. Without substantiating evidence, these remain contested narratives, but they continue to influence how the public interprets the possibility of a hidden pact. As time moved into the 2000s and 2010s, new whistleblowers emerged, though their approach was often more restrained. Rather than presenting dramatic tales of tunnels or face-to-face encounters, they spoke about funding irregularities, compartmented programs, or crash retrieval operations whispered about within aerospace circles. Former intelligence personnel hinted at classified materials classified under narrow access protocols. Engineers from defense contractors described testing metals and composites they could not fully identify. Fighter pilots recounted interference from unidentified craft that disabled weapons systems. These accounts did not always reference Eisenhower or treaties directly, but researchers often framed them as pieces fitting into the broader continuity that began in 1954. It is revealing how these newer voices sometimes withstood scrutiny. In recent hearings, decorated aviators and intelligence officers testified under oath about encounters and internal processes that left anomalies unexplained. Unlike Cooper and Schneider, their credibility has been bolstered by sensor data, flight logs, and chain-of-command reporting. Yet their willingness to speak has not come without pressure. A number described losing clearances, resigning early, or facing bureaucratic repercussions. In this, the parallel to earlier figures appears again. Those who push against informational boundaries often experience professional or personal cost, even if not in the dramatic fashion of their predecessors. The repetition of themes across generations raises a difficult point. Cooper described treaties permitting experimentation. Schneider described clashes in subterranean projects. Later whistleblowers spoke about retrieval programs and contractual secrecy clauses. The details rarely align perfectly, but each shares a framework rooted in secrecy, technology exchange, and a government action taken far from public view. Critics see these as cultural echoes of the same mythology recycling itself. Advocates of continuity argue that consistent warnings, regardless of embellishment, suggest a kernel of suppressed reality. The divide hinges not only on what was said, but how much weight to give the credibility of the messenger. It is also essential to recognize that supporters and detractors both contribute to the impact of these stories. Cooper and Schneider's reputations, volatile, confrontational, and at times erratic, made them easy targets for dismissal. At the same time, their insistence on government secrecy resonated widely, persuading audiences already skeptical of official narratives. When later whistleblowers emphasized technical anomalies and buried budgets instead of face-to-face encounters, their accounts reached more mainstream venues, including congressional forums. Together, these tiers of testimony, dramatic, controversial, and restrained, have created an arc stretching from the 1980s through the present. Several high-profile claimants did die under circumstances that their supporters called suspicious. Official explanations always varied: confrontations with police, suicide rulings, or unremarkable natural causes, but none provided conclusive public evidence of targeted silencing. This nuance matters. To treat their deaths as outright proof of suppression oversteps the available facts. Yet the suspicion itself has endured, reinforcing the perception of a long-running effort to discourage disclosure. Whether grounded in fact or coincidence, These outcomes sustain the broader climate in which treaty allegations remain plausible to many. In recent years, whistleblowers found a new context for their concerns. After the release of Pentagon UAP reports in 2021 and 2022, legislators introduced provisions designed to protect those with knowledge of classified programs. The UAP Whistleblower Protection Act became a point of debate in 2023 to 24, creating mechanisms for individuals to share experiences with Congress without losing security clearances or facing retaliation. Hearings highlighted how past whistleblowers were discredited or ignored, and lawmakers argued that the credibility of pilots and intelligence officers demanded safeguards. This development marks a turning point, where previous figures like Cooper and Schneider faced suspicion and isolation. Contemporary voices now have procedural channels to testify legally. Even so, cultural memory of past whistleblowers colors the debate. Advocates see such protections as long overdue. Skeptics worry they may legitimize unverified claims. Despite their contradictions, the accounts share one compelling feature: persistence. Testimonies have spanned decades, often shaped by very different personalities and levels of access to classified information. Their details differ, but the through line remains the alleged decisions of the mid-1950s. If all are fabrications, then it is striking that unrelated figures across eras return to the same date and the same president. If any contain pieces of truth, then those truths have been embedded in a culture of secrecy too thick for confirmation. The relevance of these testimonies is not only historical. They inform how policymakers and the public receive modern disclosures. Reports of unusual craft supported by radar or infrared tracking are evaluated today against a backdrop of decades-long allegations and warnings. Cooper and Schneider are still cited by communities seeking historical roots for present-day findings. Congressional action on whistleblower protection signals that the government, finally, is acknowledging patterns that once lived only in rumor. At their core, these accounts raise an unresolved ethical question. How much secrecy should a government sustain in the name of national security, and at what cost to citizens whose testimonies have been marginalized? For some, the issue echoes deeper, whether history itself has been shaped by agreements hidden beneath layers of denial. What is certain is that these stories, contested as they are, place lawmakers in a difficult position. Officials today take sworn testimony and demand reports under penalty of perjury. Yet some of the questions they ask are the same ones voiced decades ago by whistleblowers who lacked any protection. That continuity has become more than an odd cultural echo. It now directly intersects with institutions designed to hold power accountable. From this convergence arises a pressing dilemma. When patterns of silence stretch across generations, what is Congress prepared to do with the responsibility handed to it? Congress, secrecy, and the treaty today. In Washington, unidentified aerial phenomena shifted from rumor to scheduled hearings between 2023 and 2025. What had once been dismissed as speculation now appeared in official transcripts. Committees called not anonymous citizens but decorated pilots, defense officials, and aerospace engineers. Witnesses spoke under oath, entering their accounts into the congressional record. For lawmakers, the central question was less about whether UAP existed at all, and more about how much had been withheld by the executive branch and the Pentagon, and for how long. National security served as the framing device, but underneath lay persistent unease. Accountability had drifted too far behind secrecy. This shift did not arrive suddenly. It was built on a sequence of concrete milestones. In June 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its preliminary assessment of UAP, an official report that acknowledged 144 incidents dating back to 2004, only one of which could be explained with confidence. Almost a year later, on May 17, 2022, the House Intelligence Committee held the first open hearing on the topic in more than 50 years. Defense officials admitted the Pentagon's database had grown to roughly 400 reports. For the first time, congressmen pressed government witnesses about objects performing extraordinary maneuvers in restricted airspace, and the answers were cautious but direct. Many of the incidents remained unresolved, and no foreign adversary had been confirmed responsible. Those hearings led directly to the creation of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, in July 2022. The Department of Defense tasked this new office with consolidating investigations across different military branches. ARO built its own public-facing presence in 2023 with the launch of a website designed to provide updates and an eventual reporting portal for service members. The move signaled a recognition that, at least within defense structures, unexplained encounters would be treated as legitimate subjects of analysis rather than fringe distractions. Lawmakers and journalists could now point to an organization, funded and operating under congressional mandate, as evidence of institutional seriousness. Momentum grew in 2023 as whistleblower allegations entered public view. Former intelligence staff described retrieval programs, funding irregularities, and technologies allegedly hidden within contractor silos. Press coverage gave these accounts oxygen, but what mattered most was that congressional committees began using them to argue for legal protections. By mid-2023, language appeared in the National Defense Authorization Act guaranteeing safeguards for defense and intelligence employees who came forward with information on UAP programs. The push showed Congress moving from curiosity into active oversight. For the whistleblowers themselves, it represented the first structural acknowledgement that their information deserved protection rather than dismissal. These developments set the stage for the 2024 and 2025 hearings that drew national attention. Witnesses like Navy pilot Alexandra Wiggins and intelligence officer Jeffrey Nuxatelli gave public testimony about how sightings were reported, how chain-of-command responses downplayed them, and how retaliation had discouraged personnel from speaking openly until new protections were in place. Their statements did not prove the existence of hidden treaties or extraordinary deals, but they underscored how standard military culture had long suppressed reporting. The credibility of these witnesses, rooted in flight logs, sensor data, and years of service, made their concerns harder to dismiss than whistleblowers of earlier eras. The questions posed by lawmakers increasingly returned to physical evidence. Senators and representatives wanted clarity about alleged crash retrieval programs, about which contractors held classified debris, and why reports sometimes referenced biological materials. That phrasing, which appeared in committee transcripts in 2024, stood out. In past decades, such wording might have been scrubbed before reaching the record. Now it was repeated under oath, with officials pressed to explain what members of Congress had seen in closed-door briefings. Defense witnesses often paused, qualifying their answers with references to classification. What reached the public was, therefore, incomplete, but the implication was obvious. Accountability had become unavoidable. Leaks from investigative journalists added further tension. Reports in 2024 described memos noting protocols for monitoring abductions, documents that seemed to echo long-standing suspicions tied to 1950s lore. Although no published material amounted to proof of any treaty, the leaks drew press and lawmakers closer together. Headlines that once trafficked in speculation now appeared in mainstream outlets, with direct references to congressional oversight. The result was an amplified question echoing through committee hearings. If crash retrievals and non-human materials had been studied for decades, why had these operations remained shielded from elected representatives? Congressional initiatives began to crystallize around specific proposals. Lawmakers called for declassifying portions of materials recovered in past incidents. Contractors suspected of holding advanced alloys under classified budgets were explicitly named in hearings. Bills drafted in late 2024 asked for independent review panels, combining experts across domains to evaluate artifacts. Others sought confidential deposition sessions to shield sensitive contractors while still providing data to Congress. While the public remained excluded from much of what was shown, the clear shift came in jurisdiction. Oversight was now legislative, not just executive or military. It is necessary here to mark the limits. Congress is pressing for declassification, oversight of crash retrievals, records of materials and acquisitions, and stronger protections for whistleblowers. But lawmakers have not uncovered, let alone publicized, a signed Eisenhower-era treaty. No smoking gun document has been presented to confirm the Greada narrative. What the record does show is that representatives continue to circle questions familiar to anyone who has studied those stories. References to nuclear sites, biological concerns, and recovered craft. These are not confirmations of the treaty theory, but resonances that lawmakers today approach through the framework of oversight rather than allegory. The bipartisan character of this momentum also deserves attention. In years when Congress was sharply divided on policy, representatives from opposite sides of the aisle set aside differences to demand UAP transparency. For some, the issue centered on defense spending, Taxpayers deserved to know how classified budgets were being allocated. For others, the concern was human rights. If citizens had been exposed to unknown phenomena or risks, then silence represented neglect of duty. These overlapping perspectives produced rare agreement, enabling pressure to build in ways that might not have been possible in more partisan climates. As hearings continued, officials repeatedly confronted frustration. Journalists described them as visibly uneasy when asked whether materials recovered were of terrestrial origin. Legislators rephrased questions to emphasize responsibility. If the Pentagon could rule out adversaries, why did answers still stop short of full explanations? The lack of definitive response fueled further suspicion. And in the background, researchers drew comparisons to themes long associated with Eisenhower's missing night. Crash retrievals replaced technology exchange. Biological references echoed abduction narratives. Attention to nuclear facility incidents paralleled Cold War anxieties. These rhythms gave the impression of old questions resurfacing through new institutional channels. A critical difference, however, separates present debates from past lore. What is unfolding now carries institutional mechanisms. Record Group 615 was created by the National Archives in 2024 to manage UAP documents transferred from agencies. Whistleblowers testify under legal protections. ARO exists as a funded office with reporting obligations. These steps anchor the debate in structures of governance. The content remains unproven in many respects, but the process has left rumor far behind. That, in itself, is evidence of how far the subject has migrated into legitimacy. For advocates of disclosure, the irony is unmistakable. Allegations of a hidden agreement struck in the 1950s continue to live on in rumor. Yet modern congressional oversight has adopted vocabulary that often mirrors those same themes. Lawmakers request biological evidence and data from nuclear facilities without perhaps recognizing the overlap with stories whispered decades earlier. Skeptics, meanwhile, stress the absence of any treaty document and note that similarities can easily arise from cultural repetition rather than factual continuity. Both points stand. Congress is demanding accountability, but no record has confirmed a 7-decade-old pact. The challenge now sits with lawmakers. Their sustained oversight may determine whether unexplained incidents remain locked inside the classification system or whether some portion of records, materials, or analysis finally reaches the public. Pressure is building, hearings continue, and the language of accountability now dominates where silence once prevailed. As these questions enter the formal corridors of government, the shadow of Eisenhower's era lingers. The disputes over nuclear weapons, biological research, and secret agreements have returned, reshaped into today's vocabulary of oversight and disclosure. The historical link remains unproven, yet the echoes are clear. What happens next depends on whether officials choose continuity and secrecy or embrace the risks of transparency. That choice carries consequences not just for history, but for the generations who must live with its results. If any agreement was made in 1954, the public historical record offers no confirmation. What modern hearings, Pentagon reports, and whistleblower testimonies have done is move the subject out of rumor and into official oversight. The core question, whether a treaty shaped technology or policy in lasting ways, remains unresolved. But for the first time, that question is being asked in open forums, congressional halls, and archival collections rather than whispered on the margins. We'd like to hear your perspective. What kind of evidence would convince you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you'd like updates on future declassifications we'll be analyzing here. 70 years later, the question isn't just what happened on February 20th, 1954. It's what we're prepared to do with the questions that still remain.